This is Dateline News and Conversation. The topic tonight, dissent and protest continues in Maine, along with censorship. I'm very happy to do this show and the previous show that I've done with some of my dear friends from Maine, because not only am I inspired by what they're doing, but I believe that what they're doing is an example of what continued protests must look like. Tonight, I'm welcoming back to the show my dear friend Lisa Savage and Luke Brooks-Shesler. Welcome to the show, friends.
Thank you.
Thanks, Regis.
Well, I'm really proud of you guys and what you're doing. I've been interviewing a number of people recently who are doing different things. I've interviewed a couple of authors, film producers, and activists who know that to be successful, I don't mean that we're going to win this battle, but in getting the word out and in educating people. And I'm really proud of what you're doing. I spent many hours and days with Lisa and our good friend Bruce Gagnon and so many others, covering a variety of protests, from environmental issues to the Bath Iron Works building of destroyers that are designed to kill people around the world, to protest against the war in Iraq and in Libya and Syria, and to the Occupy movement. So, Lisa, I'm going to begin first with you. You are one persistent woman, I have to say that. You're writing an incredible blog. We'll talk about that in a little bit, and I'll post the link to it. You ran for the United States Senate against the incumbent and entrenched, moneyed person, Susan Collins. And I think you surprised a lot of people. You didn't win. The deck was stacked. But I think you showed the grit and the need to speak truth to power, to speak truth to the empire. I'm so proud to have you as a friend. So,
thank you, Regis.
Well, you're welcome. So I want to ask you tonight about a number of things. Number one, who has been organizing these protests?
Well, it's been a group, a coalition of statewide groups. You mentioned Bruce Gagnon. Bruce and I are kind of the lead organizers. We may switch off on, if one of us is traveling or has some other things going on one month or the next. We've been doing them monthly pretty much since December. And our list of co-sponsors has grown quite a bit. We just got Veterans for Peace National this week, which I was very happy to have. But we have been representing groups such as the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, which is an international group of scholars paying attention to the weaponization of space. The Maine Natural Guard, which is an organization I founded that's basically a very simple pledge organization to connect the dots between militarism and harm to our climate. We have the Maine Communist Party. We have the Party of Socialism and Liberation in Maine. We have the Maine Green Independent Party. We have the Peace and Justice Center of Eastern Maine, and the People's Party of Maine. I believe that's the complete list as of today. So it's grown with each monthly gathering. And we also have attracted people from both of the mainstream parties. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party would never endorse an anti-war event because they are sponsored by the corporations that make vast sums of money from our wars and constant militarization. But we've had certainly a lot of individuals from those parties, from the Libertarian Party. And one of the things that we've been really noticing is another reflection of how the public is perceiving this war. We've been out there since more than a year ago when it became evident that the war would start, the proxy war, NATO's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine is how I usually call it. I know, Regis, you don't like calling it a proxy war, but to the American public, they still have not, most of them really grasped that this is the US and NATO's war. Ukraine is just a pawn in their game and has suffered badly for it. We are seeing more open displays of agreement and thanking us for being there, a shouting agreement with the points that are made on our signs. We have quite a list of demands, and the signs reflect, a broad group of messages centered around U.S. militarism is killing the planet, and we can't afford it here in the U.S. Every city in the U.S. has, hundreds, if not thousands of citizens sleeping on the pavement every night. Children go to bed without enough to eat, but we've been able to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into the war in Ukraine. The public is really objecting to this on several grounds. And one of the most cogent, and it kind of circles me back to my youth. I was a young teenager when the war in Vietnam was on, and I was against that one too. But the fear of nuclear war is growing among the American public. They're hearing a lot of nuclear saber rattling by the US. They're hearing a lot of claims that Russia or North Korea are the ones rattling the nuclear sabers. I don't believe that's true, but based on the very limited and very censored information that the American public receives, they think that's true. And really, the depleted uranium weapons, which few Americans know about, that the British sent to Ukraine recently were blown up in a big hit on a big weapons and ammunition dump that Russia made on, Ukraine's striking at their ability to continue the war. And that has sent a radioactive plume up into the air that's, drifting into Poland and then Western Europe. Do people in the US or even the EU know about that? I don't think many of them do. But that is a real and present danger that many of the people who joined us last Saturday mentioned, the threat of nuclear war. There were grandparents like me. There were people about to become a dad for the first time, and many, all ages in between. And that is a definitely a strong theme of these protests.
Well, you're to be complimented for being so inclusive of these different groups, from libertarians to the Communist Party to whoever they are, People Party of Maine to the Greens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because on the national level, they haven't been so successful, which has been kind of a disappointment. But you have made that a possibility, a reality in Maine. The other thing you mentioned among several that I think is of real critical importance, and I'm going to ask Luke, as a younger person, how he feels about it. But I've been concerned about the fear of nuclear war between Russia and the United States since before 2014, 2015, when I started working on my film, 30 Seconds to Midnight, which was all about a possibility of a war. Instead of having it at 2.5 minutes, like the doomsday clock of the Board of Atomic Scientists, I said, boy, they're either delusional or they're misleading the public, because it's more like 30 seconds. And Lisa, you talked about, I use the word gaslighting. The United States primarily, and some Europeans, have been gaslighting the world with this fear of a possible nuclear war that will be started by Russia using regional, smaller nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I believe now we are so close to the possibility of a nuclear war, maybe not because there's some mad psychopathic Dr. Strangelove in a basement in Washington, D.C., but by an accident. the forces are so close to each other. There's American troops, there's British troops, there's Canadian troops, there's troops from Germany in Ukraine fighting, commanding, providing intelligence, etc., etc. And the danger of a conflict breaking out because of a misjudgment, a misreading of a radar screen, or somebody just makes a mistake is really severe. Luke, I'd like to know how you feel as a younger person about the possibility of a nuclear war, and perhaps you could share a little bit about what others in your generation might feel, if you know.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know. I guess I've had quite a bit of a political evolution over the past couple years, and nuclear war is now my number one issue, because if there's a nuclear war and there's nuclear annihilation, then literally nothing else matters. As far as, what people in my generation might feel, I've found a lot of people, especially recently, who are concerned about this and who take it very seriously. But by and large, the vast majority of people also that I'm very close friends with, that are intelligent people, I respect them, our kids play together. I think there's a certain element of denial. People simply aren't thinking about it, or they might say, yes, this is a threat, this is a danger, but, they'll figure something out. It's going to be fine.
That's my fear. Lisa and I will both remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the children were told to duck and cover under their desks. And I was in high school at the time, but everybody was terrified, not just in the United States, but people around the world realized that it could be all over, as you mentioned, Luke, with a nuclear annihilation, a nuclear Armageddon.
If I can
and
just
that's my
say, I
Yeah.
thought it was extremely cynical of the G7 to hold their summit in Hiroshima. Hiroshima being the first city that was subjected to a nuclear bomb attack by the U.S. The G7 is, the U.S. and other rich countries. To have it in Hiroshima, and supposedly on the agenda was progress toward nuclear disarmament, they made zero progress toward nuclear disarmament at that summit. And I think they picked Hiroshima basically as a subliminal message of, like, we did it before, we can do it again. And, one of the things I think modern people don't maybe know about, because it's too scary to think about, is modern nuclear weapons are way more powerful than the bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, way more destructive. And again, decades have gone by without them being used, and it was once unthinkable. But a nation that will use depleted uranium and cause birth defects in Iraq and former Yugoslavia, they have the moral standing to use nuclear weapons to get their way. And I really thought meeting in Hiroshima was awful. I lived in Japan years ago, and kind of as a scholar, I taught English a little bit, and it was always really interesting to me. My oldest child was born on Pearl Harbor Day in Tokyo, coincidentally, and my friends were all, university educated people in Japan and living in Tokyo. And if I said to them what a weird coincidence it was, they were like, "What's Pearl Harbor Day?" And I said, "Oh, well, that's when Japan attacked the U.S. Navy in Hawaii and brought the U.S. into World War II. "Oh, yeah, I have kind of heard of that." And I said, "Well, what date do you associate with World War II?" And they were like, August 8th, duh, the day the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. I said to them at that time, "Why do you think Japan got dragged into that war? Why were they making kamikaze airplanes with no landing gear?" And the people that I was talking to, this is in the early 80s, said, "Oh, the big business cartels wanted the war. The people didn't want the war. We were all hungry. We were, barely feeding our families, but they dragged us into the war, and there we went." I feel like I'm in that moment now.
Yeah, I do too. And for me, this war is pretty close to home. We're not and haven't been in any danger here in Yalta and in most parts of Crimea, but there have been acts of sabotage by sleeper cells, rat lines of pro-Ukrainian people, and they've been influenced by the Ukrainian secret services to do this. So this war is really very real to me. But I have to say this: people here are going about their daily lives not in fear at all, living life as they always have, and they're torn apart because this war is between brothers and sisters, Slavs against Slavs. Ukraine had possession of Crimea since 1954, and these people have intermarried all those years, and including during the Soviet Union. And so when this war broke out and the referendum took place, it split families. Divorces happened, record numbers. And now the people here are suffering not only from the divorces, so to speak, because the blood of their brothers and sisters is being spilt needlessly. And they feel that very strongly. But you wouldn't know it from daily life here. Lisa, I want to ask you another question. Have you been seeing any young new faces or any new faces at these rallies, these protests that you've been organizing?
Well, definitely. That's how I met Luke. Luke would be the first to tell you I'm not really that young, but he's a lot younger than I am. Yes, we're seeing young people, quite young people in their 20s, who are in their 30s, in their 40s. We're seeing middle-aged people in their 50s, people in their 60s, and then the traditional peace community of Maine basically cut their teeth on Vietnam War resistance, and so they are now in their 70s or 80s. Every single time we hold one of these protests on a Saturday afternoon, we have new people come that we did not meet before. One of the happiest things I heard, at the end of standing, we pick a big intersection with a lot of traffic. We've been traveling around the state to different big intersections. We all hold our signs and we try to stand on as many parts of that intersection for about an hour. And then we circle up. Someone brings a portable megaphone and everybody's invited to say who they are, where they're from, and why they're there. And as we were moving toward that circle up last Saturday in Belfast, I overheard something that just warmed my heart. And that was one person saying to another, I don't know who it was, they were behind me, what did you say your name was again? That tells me that two new friends met around the common concern for security and a future for humankind. And, of course, we invite people to put their names on our mailing list, and then they start getting news of the next events that are planned. We've now picked our dates all through the summer, Regis. I don't know if you want me to say what they are, but
no. Well, I'd like to come to that at the end.
Sure.
So let's wait for that.
I think Luke met some fellow faith community folks. He was not with us last Saturday because he had to work, but a theme last Saturday was people from various faith communities saying, where are my faith community members? Why do they not care about this war? They are not standing up for the ideals that our, faith believes in. That's been a kind of constant theme and thread. And I know that at one of the protests, not the first one you came to, Luke, but one of the subsequent ones, you were thrilled that some other people from the church that you go to in another part of Maine had come. And so there was a little sort of like a mini, congregation there at the protest. So that's been an interesting development as well. Some of the big traditional peace organizations in Maine have really fallen for the Democratic Party propaganda. I think they take funding from the Democratic Party, and they have really failed to critique this war and stand up against NATO. I'm always amazed, how could you find yourself on the side of NATO, the most warmongering, violence-projecting organization, on the planet, and you're siding with NATO, really? But that is the power of propaganda. people that listen to NPR, read the New York Times and the Washington Post, watch CNN, they really don't know, they don't have any access to real information. So they accept a lot of lies about what's going on.
Yeah, you know, I was born and raised in very Catholic, French Canadian, patriotic American family. And, you know, I went on to a career in the Roman Catholic Church, as you know, Lisa, and some people. And I've been so disappointed that there has been nothing that I've seen that's coming from Catholic churches around the country like they did during the Vietnam War and the civil rights movements. Clergy, nuns, priests, parishioners were everywhere. They were marching with Martin Luther King. They were protesting in front of the White House. And since the Berrigan brothers and their whole crowd of disciples have mostly died and gone on, there really hasn't been anything coming from the Catholic Church that I can see. And that's a real disappointment because its message used to be about peace, about reconciliation. And now you don't hear a peep. So, Luke, I'd like to ask you about others from faith communities that you've met. And I'd like to know who some of them are. Are they traditional groups or who are they?
So we attend the UU Church in Waterville, and I've made some inroads lately with some people. We've started talking about stuff that maybe they don't get from the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN. And lately, especially, people have been much more receptive to hearing a different perspective, at least. And I think it was 2 protests ago, I actually got a friend of mine from the UU Church to come with me. He was my first friend from the UU Church to come to a protest. And we met up with other people from a different UU Church on the coast. And it was great. And we just had this moment where we were talking to each other, and we're just so great to see each other from different church communities in different parts of Maine. And I actually, you know, exchanged contact information with them, and we've kept in touch. I wrote something to send to their church that they wanted to share with their congregation. And maybe pretty soon I'll stop by to visit their congregation and get to know more of them. So that's been great. I have to say it's been very disappointing and I guess disillusioning for me to learn over the past year that the conflict in Ukraine has been going on, how many members of the church, I guess, I don't know if it's right to say that they're pro-war. It's I don't know how to describe it. I think that they've just kind of been fed this diet of NPR and New York Times, and they feel informed and they feel strongly that, you know, there's a moral cause going on and they want to be on the side that has the moral cause, and they're convinced of that. And so if I come along and sort of question that belief, I think people feel very threatened. So it's been a challenge for me to separate my feelings about the conflict, my feelings about the people who hold certain beliefs. And recently I've just tried to step back a little bit and just to understand that I think people are trying to make the best sense out of it that they can, but it just takes a little bit of time. But I think eventually the message is coming through. And one thing I also wanted to mention is that I have a friend who's in the Maine state legislature, and this is someone I'll stop by his house. We'll have a beer. He's great. I love him. He also is from a Catholic background, and they're very devout Catholics. And he voted in favor of the Maine legislature had a vote, I guess, a couple months ago to support, basically expressing support for the conflict in Ukraine. You know, the United States funding and perpetuation of the conflict in Ukraine. And I talked to my friend, and I think this occurred over text message, but I said, you know, you have very strong feelings of faith, and you also, for example, are a pro-life person. And I don't know how perpetuating and supporting war is consistent with a pro-life position. And we haven't had a chance to get together and talk about it yet. He's totally open to talk about that. But I do feel like I'm coming across people who, at least in my mind, are taking very contradictory positions on the war and other issues that they care about strongly in different aspects of life.
Well, thank you for that, Luke. I think what you're doing is really terrific. You're making new friends in the faith community, sharing your writings, and your intention to visit some others. This is such important work. I think the one-to-one contact with people is so important. Many people don't read, or if they do read, as soon as they see it's something they don't like, they're done with it. But in person, it's really hard to really dismiss somebody that quickly. So I think that's really great. And you had mentioned in a previous show we did with Bruce Gagnon that you had been feeling a sense of alienation because you felt you were the only one in your crowd that felt this way. But when you discovered the group, you found that you were not alone. That's another message I'd like for people to understand. And I think many people who have watched my shows and the attempts I've made to bring people together through webinars has confirmed in my mind that there's millions of people just like us around the world who feel alienated, who feel rejected by friends and family, and they find their solace and confirmation of themselves through meetings like this. I think that's really important. Luke, I want to stay with you. I've been really impressed with the signs that people are carrying. Now, in all the rallies and protests that I attended in Maine, people always carried signs. But now there's some different kind of signs. One of them that I saw that Lisa posted, and I'm going to put on top of this video, a very young woman, really bright eyes, a big smile on her face, was out there with a sign protesting against this war. What are some of your favorite signs that you see, and what are you carrying these days?
So my all-time favorite sign is one that Bruce Gagnon made, and it said, I think it says, "The U.S. destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline," and I like that sign because, as far as I'm concerned, it's very cut and dry that that's what happened. Seymour Hersh came out with the article, and all the other stories are pretty, in my opinion, pretty flimsy cover stories. So I kind of like the shock value of the truth when you see that sign, "The U.S. destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines." I also like the other signs about abolish NATO. I have to say, my politics has changed quite a bit over the past couple of years, and I guess I can't fault people for thinking that NATO is a force for good, because I thought so as well until recently, because NATO was there as a defensive alliance to protect countries from attack. But then if you actually think one step past that, you realize that it's an offensive military alliance. And it took me a while to put two and two together. So I really like the abolish NATO signs. And I like the sign that says "Warhawks out of DC." It's just impossible for me to believe that the people in charge are just perpetuating this endless war. And if it's not in Afghanistan, then we're just going to switch to some other conflict somewhere else in the world. So I like the Warhawks out of DC signs as well.
All right, so Lisa, I want you to follow up on that. What are some of your favorite signs? And do you have one in particular that you carry?
Yeah, I've been carrying a sign that has the NATO in block letters and then the universal red circle with a slash across it. I think when I make a sign, I'm thinking about the audience. They're driving past. Typically, they only get a glimpse of us. So I try to go for something graphic that's not too wordy, and that would make them think. I really like the Warhawks out of Washington, D.C. sign also because it names names. It says Newland, Blinken, Sullivan. I think there's a fourth name on there. I'm not sure which one. I just spoke in Belfast. I happened to stand next to the man who collaborated with his wife on that particular sign. And they had stood with us months ago in Bath, and they left the sign for us. He had shown up Saturday with a handmade sign again that said that same message, but looked less graphically successful. And he said, "Oh yeah, my wife made the other one. She's the graphic artist." And we had a really interesting discussion about, where do you think the U.S. went off the rails here? And realizing that for us, it dates way back before. I used to think the unfortunate events of 9/11 kind of kicked off this whole endless war, new enemy every time you turn around, and also a big censorship and surveillance regime that, was put in place against the entire population. But really, if you look back, it's before that. One of the interesting things in Maine, is that we had this very famous child anti-war activist named Samantha Smith back during the Cold War era. She wrote a letter to Yuri Andropov and expressed, like, do we really have to die of a nuclear war? Can we just not find a way to get along? And was invited to the USSR and went as a kind of citizen ambassador. She's kind of famous in Maine. Her birthday's coming up, and I know there are going to be some events around that. There's a statue of her in front of the Maine State House. But I always think about Samantha Smith because she had the courage to think out of we are, two enemies like this box and say, really? Like, even as far as nuclear Armageddon, we're going to go that far on this? But the false dichotomy is used to great effect here in the US to confuse people. And one of the reasons I'm not as surprised that a lot of people have not joined me protesting the Ukraine war, although it's building now, but is because if you were out in the streets against the Iraq war, you thought there was this huge anti-war movement. But as soon as Obama got elected, they all went home. So there's a certain kind of person that only opposes wars when there's a Republican in the White House. Sorry, my cat is bumping my computer. But they do not oppose wars when there's a Democrat in the White House. That's just nonsense as far as I'm concerned. But it's a strong factor. The U.S. Deep state, if you will, has managed to politicize wars so that it's red team or blue team conducting them. And that's been effective. So many of my old anti-war friends have said, "Oh, Lisa, you sound like you're saying Putin's talking points for him." I'm like, why would I do that? I'm not Russian. I don't know. I haven't been to Russia. Maine used to have this huge friendship, sister city, structures in place. When I moved back to Maine in the late 80s, that was going strong. They're always like, well, why don't you criticize Russia? Well, I don't pay taxes in Russia. I didn't vote for President Putin. I try to hold my own government accountable for their huge role in ongoing wars around the world that threaten people's safety. But it's very much like I'm not a Democrat, and I haven't been for a long, long time. And people have a hard time wrapping their head around that. Oh, but Orange Man bad. They hated Trump so much. And that was a setup, a deliberate setup to put Trump in office, get all the liberals to hate him. And then once he was out of office, they had this like void at the center of their life. Now, what do I do? And Putin was so easily slipped into that space. It's really rather cleverly done. It's diabolical and evil, but you have to kind of admire the effective decades-long strategy of controlling the mind of the U.S. populace. Back in the Vietnam War, we were against it because, one, there was a draft, and two, we saw the death and destruction on our television screens every night on the news. Well, the deep state figured out that both those things were very much obstacles to continuing a regime of endless wars. So we have no draft, and really they can hardly get anybody to sign up for the volunteer army anymore. They think they're solving that with robots and AI. We'll see. But we don't see the war in Ukraine. We don't see the wars that the U.S. conducts in the media, so that we can be horrified by them.
Yeah. Samantha Smith, by the way, from our home state, is still very, very well known by people here in Russia. In fact, there is a camp. It's called Artek, not too far from Yalta, where thousands of Russian youth come there. They come for different times of the year, and it's an educational process. They travel around Crimea. They learn about the history, etc. And Samantha Smith is still considered an icon amongst the young people who are thirsting for peace, a friendly, peaceful world. You mentioned how crafty they are. These people who have crafted these messages and this agenda are not stupid. They're very bright people. They may have miscalculated, and I think they have, but when they paint President Putin as a thug, as an assassin, and they canonize the killer-in-chief Barack Hussein Obama, who killed more people indiscriminately than President Putin could ever imagine. Barack Obama persecuted and prosecuted more whistleblowers in his administration than all the previous presidents before him. He is the criminal in chief. And it angers me when people without any facts, without any foundational proof, are calling Putin an assassin, a murderer, that he murders his opponents, which is completely false. Anyway, you mentioned something really important. It's the Democratic Party is the war party now, and all the protests stopped when Obama, Clinton went into office. They stopped. And that's really a sad thing to say. I'd like to know something else about the signs, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to come back to you on that because you've been at this for a long time. Who makes these signs? Are people completely free to make whatever signs they want? Do they share them with other people? It seemed like the man that you mentioned shared it with your group. How does that work?
Yeah, there's a lot of sharing that goes on. Some of us are better sign makers than others. One man who's been coming for over a year now, who I think is a Republican, made this great, really long banner that he had printed commercially that said "No War with Russia." It's red and it has big white letters, "No War with Russia," very visible in an intersection. He just recently had those remade on vinyl because his original ones were on paper and they were getting too shredded by the weather. And he lent one to me. He made 3. I think he's lending Bruce the other one. As I mentioned, the man that had made the sign, or the man and his wife had made some signs. We usually bring a stack of signs. People, if they don't have their own, they can rifle through. But, we don't censor the messages that people are bringing. We've put out a press release with the list of demands that we're organizing around. So the reporters and the media have a, clear statement of what we're standing for. But, if somebody wants to focus on no war with China or, the threat of nuclear war, or somebody older, I don't know who made this sign, but somebody was carrying a sign in Belfast that said nuclear war with both Russia and China. Question mark, exclamation point, as if, this is part of the just delusional thinking that we couldn't prevail in Afghanistan, where we're going to beat 2 major military powers that are also nuclear capable. But yeah, the signs are usually just handmade. We do have the Party of Socialism and Liberation. Younger people have been bringing these printed signs that, again, are very visible, black on white. And I noticed that some of their signs say answer.org at the bottom, which is another big anti-war, a national leftist anti-war organization here in the US. So, but yeah, some of the messages are more generically, war is not healthy for children and other living things. That's an old Vietnam War dissent message. It varies. Someone brought, I don't know if your audience would know Bread and Puppet as a very political lefty artist group out of Vermont that's for decades. And they had come to Maine, and someone in Maine was inspired to make one of their giant puppets. So it was very, very tall. It was Flora, the earth goddess, and she's wearing a flowered dress. And she didn't have a message per se, but many of the people who came last Saturday said, "Oh, Flora is here," as if that was a person that they had seen at many protests and, felt warmly about. So, some people have signs that say healthcare, not warfare. Some people have signs that say violence begets violence. There's quite a range of reasons to object to this particular war, and I think we're seeing most of them.
Can you send me a photograph of that long banner that man made about no war with Russia? I don't think I have that one. I'd like to have it. If you have
it's
one.
right in the center of the group photo, and it's very visible there. So
okay.
I'm not sure I got a good photo of it. It's it's always hard to not get run over when you're doing this in an intersection. You want a good picture of, Luke standing on the corner with his sign, but you may have to stand out in the middle of traffic to get it. So,
all right, Luke, I want to ask you this because, and then Lisa can follow up if necessary. I'm concerned. Maine is a rural state. You're not getting any support really, except for an occasional article that somebody may publish in whatever, the Portland Press Herald or Bangor Daily or whatever it is. How did you find out about these protests that were going on? And do you know how other people find out? Is there some kind of network, or how does it happen according to you?
So I'm a big Jimmy Dore fan, and Jimmy was talking about the Rage Against the War Machine protests, and I was unable to go all the way to DC, so I just Googled Rage Against the War Machine, and I found that there was a protest in Maine. I guess we started out in Bath on that day, and then we might have gone to Westbrook, and I just Googled it, and then I found out that there was one happening, and I just showed up, and there were Lisa and Bruce. And I just have to say, Lisa and Bruce have done such an amazing job with this, because all you have to do is know where to be and when to be there, and they take care of everything. So I have to say, I feel a little bit spoiled and also a little bit lazy that they do all this amazing work, and all I have to do is show up.
All right,
Luke,
Lisa,
I was not doing this when I had young children at home. I'll just say.
So, Lisa, how do you get the word out? How does it spread?
Well, we have an extensive email list. Bruce makes a Facebook event. So a lot of organizing in Maine takes place on Facebook. I don't use it anymore, but a lot of people do. I tweet it. We always put out a press release, and that goes out to all Maine media. And usually we get some coverage from that, and a lot of word of mouth, I think, also.
Do you think that maybe some people who have seen you on the corner time after time might have also felt, well, I'd like to join? Do you know of anybody that came to the group that way?
I'm not aware of anybody who has. We did get some media coverage from a very right-wing media outlet that just happened by in Bath the time that we were standing there. But we've been on Maine Wire, and we've been on NPR, which are on that same day from Bath. that's the spectrum of media in Maine. So the Jimmy Dore show that Luke heard was about a national event that was pretty well funded, and that had a lot of local actions like ours. But I was invited on the Jimmy Dore show last month to promote the gathering that we were going to have in Topsom on tax day. And a couple people who showed up there said, "Oh yeah, I didn't know about this, but I love Jimmy Dore, and I saw you on Jimmy Dore." So and they drove an hour and a half to get to Topsom. So I hope Jimmy Dore has me on again, or even better, has Luke on again. I had been on Jimmy Dore before during my Senate campaign, and we kind of hit it off because we're both kind of smart alecky Irish. But he does have a lot of audience in Maine. I had not realized how extensive his audience is in Maine. And he was very well. Everybody who had been at the previous demonstration, which was in Westbrook, got on the Jimmy Dore show because he showed, like you do, Regis, the group photo at the end. Some people have always left by then, but try to get people together. And so everybody that was in that photo was on Jimmy Dore.
Wow. Jimmy Dore has gained quite a following over the past few years. I even have heard that some people want Jimmy Dore for president. All right. So we've talked about the different signs that you people carry that relate to different issues. One of them that I noticed, and you had on, it's part of your list of demands, is end U.S. aid to racist apartheid Israel. That can be dangerous ground. Tell me about that.
Well, when we went out in March, we were part of a national day of action, or week of action, it might have been. We stood March 18th. And at that time, a group, an anti-war coalition called UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, I think is what the C stands for, that I've participated in for years now, had developed a list of demands that were, I thought, really comprehensive and attended to social justice and racial justice, as well as foreign policy. So that is one of the demands that we adopt. We basically adopted their list of demands, which would include end AFRICOM. Something that, again, is invisible to most Americans, is that the U.S. military is deep, deep in the continent of Africa. A lot of the refugees we're seeing in Maine are fleeing the wars caused by militarism in Africa. And the Israel demand was part of that. We added a climate demand, that war is very bad for the environment, to the UNEC list. And then we've stayed with that list because it seemed that people had put a lot of thought into developing them. I've stood for Palestinian rights for years. I used to administer the Maine BDS page on Facebook. I've stood outside Remax Realty with a call to, pressure them to stop profiting off apartheid. As we're seeing, Israel is really becoming far more violent and far more right-wing with each passing day. And the current generation of Palestinian freedom fighters are like, nonviolence has not worked for us. We are being pushed off our land, pushed out of our homes, and killed. Even children are killed and tortured regularly by the Israeli Defense Force. Violently occupying someone else's land is not pretty. And believe me, the U.S. has proven that here in North America, where we violently dispossessed the indigenous people. And the indigenous people are still here and are still resisting. But Israel is a particular flashpoint. And interestingly, an area where many faith communities in the U.S. have traditionally stood with Palestinians. Two of the people that were holding signs about that in not this month, but last month, are members of Pax Christi, who are radical Catholics that very often advocate for the rights of the Palestinian people to live in peace. And I was really happy that they brought their signs because it's good to have a big tent and a broad platform. Some people are moved. Often it has to do with visiting somewhere. If you've been somewhere and you've met the people that are suffering, such as you and Bruce did, Regis, then when a war breaks out there, it really tugs at your heartstrings. You really feel strong empathy for the people that are suffering under that particular example of militarism.
What are some of the other demands, Lisa? You've mentioned a few, but I noticed that I was looking at your list, and there's a few more that I think are really important. And quite frankly, I was surprised at a couple of them on there.
Yeah, here we go. The complete list of demands are, in this order: peace in Ukraine, no weapons, no money for the Ukraine war; abolish NATO, end U.S. militarism and sanctions. Another thing we haven't talked about, but economic warfare. For decades, the U.S. has so many countries under sanctions at this point. Backfired on them sanctioning Russia. Russia's prospered, and Europe and the U.S. are floundering economically, but fund people's needs, not the war machine. We had a couple social workers with us last month, this month, as we often do, and they can't stand to see the money being wasted and people are sleeping on the pavement. No war with China. Protect Earth's environment from the deadly insult of war. End U.S. aid to racist apartheid Israel. Fight racism and bigotry, not war. U.S. hands off Haiti. End AFRICOM.
The one U.S. hands off Haiti, I'm aware of what the U.S. has been doing there, but I was quite surprised to see it on there. Where did that come from?
Again, UNEC is a national group of peace and social and racial justice groups. They work in coalition. They have lots of younger members. They have lots of people of color from groups that are organizing elsewhere than Maine. And I have a lot of respect for their organization. I know that they're thoughtful. One of the members of that coalition is the Black Alliance for Peace, which Ajamu Baraka and Margaret Kimberly are both Black, intellectuals, anti-war dissidents that I've respected for years. So I think the input from many different folks made a broad and strong list of demands that we felt comfortable with.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned sanctions. Sanctions are a means of war, and they're basically war against civilians, children. They include the denial of medicine that people need to survive, to fight disease, and that people need who are diabetics. And this is affecting millions of people. And ironically, Lisa, as you mentioned, the unprecedented number of sanctions the US and the EU have levied on Russia have had just the opposite effect. I am eyewitness to that. Yes, prices have increased somewhat, 10 to 15% on just about everything. The hardship, again, is not on people who are working so much as it is on old people, pensioners, and poor people. That's who it hurts. But Russia's industry has rebounded. Investment in Russia's industry and infrastructure and their military-industrial complex has increased. Agriculture. Russia can now consider itself the breadbasket of the world. It exports more grain, wheat, and barley and fertilizer than any other country in the world. Most people talk about oil and gas, but Russia has really shown to the world, to the United States and to Europe, that it has all of the resources it needs, including the people, to be self-sustainable. And that is a goal of one Mr. Vladimir Putin, to make Russia self-sustaining. But sanctions are evil. They've hurt many of my...
The U.S. became arrogant because they would sanction a country like Iraq, and then Madeleine Albright would go on 60 Minutes and say, oh yeah, 200,000 children died because of the sanctions. Well, we think that was a price worth paying. I don't know why they don't understand that Russia is not comparable to Iraq, or China is not comparable to Cuba, which has been struggling under economic sanctions from the US for decades and has built a world-class public health program that exports public health and doctors and other caregivers.
Yeah, good point.
I don't know why they haven't caught on that, like, oh, this isn't a good, it's not a good strategy. But
yeah, well, it's a war of capitalism against socialism, really, and there's not a whole lot that's wrong about socialism that places people's needs first, and capitalism doesn't. So you mentioned the summer schedule. You folks are really planning this thing way out in advance. I'm really impressed. Where are you going and what is happening this summer?
Well, let's see. Next month on the 24th, which is a Saturday, we will be in Lewiston. That is Maine's second largest city. We've been in Portland, various locations in Maine's largest city, several times now. So Bruce said, let's go to Lewiston. It's much more of a working class town. It does have a college there, although it will be in summer. So then the following month in July, we plan to stand in Augusta, the state capital. Not a very big city, but if we go stand by the big shopping center and the civic center, I think we'll get a lot of eyeballs on our messages. In August, we are going to stand in Ellsworth. Ellsworth is sort of the gateway to the down east part of the coast that makes Maine vacation land. So many, many, many tourists will pass by us as we stand in Ellsworth for an hour in August. And then in September, we're going to return to the bridge that my blog Went to the Bridge is named after, and the bridge where I met my husband protesting the impending war on Iraq. So it's a very lucky place for me. And that is Skowhegan on the Margaret Chase Smith Bridge, where two major highways cross. And a lot of people will see us there. I think the war will be over by then, though, don't you? We can probably be done after that.
I have refrained from speculating on the end of the war, but I do think what's happening recently in terms of the fall of Bakhmut, is the Ukrainian name for this city that was fortified, huge salt mines there. Zelensky had said, this is the last stand. This is the epic battle. Well, they lost decisively to the Wagner Group, a private army that's working for the Russian military. Russia has been constantly bombarding with missiles and artillery shells and drones since October, when the attack on the bridge took place and then the pipeline's blown up. Non-stop. And this has had to take an enormous toll, not only on the lives of Russian military, but supplies, ammunition, food, water. And there are reports now coming, and they have been coming, that the Ukrainian military, by and large, is decimated and morale is really low. The only thing propping them up are mercenaries, and probably even fighters from Poland, rumored to be 10 to 20,000 of them, fighters from Germany, United States, Canada, military people, but not with their military insignia of their country, just a plain military uniform. There's not much that's holding up Ukraine anymore. There are a lot of people think it's going to be a prolonged conflict. I don't think NATO can endure a longer conflict. I don't think the United States can. There's an election coming up. And Russia, more than the rest of them combined, has the capability to sustain a much longer conflict. I don't think they want that. So my hope is that it'll be a speedy conclusion. How speedy, I don't know. But I hope maybe by the time your protests this summer take place, at least in September, it could be over. One suggestion. May I make a suggestion?
Of course.
You got to get up to Bahaba 2 or 3 times this summer. But you got people coming from all over the world to go to Bar Harbor. Boy, I think what a venue that would be. They might run you out of town, but who knows?